without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to Paul.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Paul Quinlan, and this is the story of the Northland Totara Working Group. It'll be an overview of the vision and the activities of this group. And for a start, Helen Moody and Dr. David Bergen are two people that deserve particular acknowledgement and recognition. But like many of the stories we've heard in this conference, this is really a story about a collaborative effort by a team of people who have been encouraged by a wide community of interest. Now, people who really just see an opportunity for a positive outcome in our rural environment. We're very fortunate to be coordinated by the New Zealand Landcare Trust and to have support of other organisations like Tāne's Tree Trust. The vision is about promoting the management of naturally regenerating totara trees on farms. And this is for commercial timber production and yet also for the environmental benefits that come along with that. And yet, in this country, cutting and commercial use of a native timber tree species can be a very controversial topic. So in this presentation, I'll also be explaining how come we think it could even be a good thing. And to do this, I'll be outlining the amenable characteristics of the species and the specific opportunities and restraints as I see them around realising the commercial use of this species, Podocarpus totara. I'm just going to give a whirlwind overview of the life cycle of Totara on farmland. Its stock-proof attributes give the species its weed-like ability to colonise poor pasture areas, and Dr. David Bergen's research found an excellent correlation between the establishment of Totara on steep slopes and poor pasture species. Birds distribute the seed out from existing stands, and grazing often even seems to help with seedling establishment. Dense thickets can form within paddocks up to 60,000 stems per hectare. And saplings develop into dense pole stands where competition is so fierce that growth is slowed to millimetres per year. Those natural pole stands develop and self-thinning occurs, and eventually merchantable sized trees now exist on what was previously cleared land. I believe we can conceptualise this as a unique native forest type, although it has a highly modified character. Another important attribute is that it responds very well to silviculture. In our extensive silviculture trials undertaken by Scion research scientist Dr. David Bergen involved over 38 permanent sample plots in naturally regenerated stands. These were in pairs. One plot was thinned and pruned, and the immediately adjacent plot was a control plot where absolutely no silviculture was undertaken. There was a clear early response in growth. 2 years after thinning and pruning, the mean diameter growth rates for the residual trees increased 2.5 times on average, greater than in the control plots. And essentially this graph shows that when growth and mortality are combined, the thinned stands have produced 5 cubic metres per hectare per year more stem volume than the unthinned stands. Naturally regenerated pole stands clearly present very good opportunities for silvicultural intervention. That's just improving the growth rates and the log quality by getting in there with the chainsaw and your loppers. And scale is another very important attribute of the resource. Funding assisted with our inventory project to estimate just how much Totara there really is out there on private land. The pilot study covered over 47,000 hectares of private land in the Whangaroa area, used samples of very high resolution aerial photography. Paddock trees were counted and different forest types and ages were mapped, and then this was ground truthed with randomly selected sample plots in the field where all Totara were measured and recorded. This was then correlated with the land cover database 2 information set, and later a regional estimate was extrapolated from this pilot study data. And although I must stress there's a very wide margin of error for this extrapolation, it nevertheless confirms that a significantly scaled resource already exists in the Northland region, and importantly, in the future, there'll be much more. Somewhere around 344,000 hectares of private land probably already contain Totara at various stocking rates, and with perhaps around 8 million cubic metres of total tree volume. However, being an untended natural resource, a high proportion of the trees are relatively short and heavily branched, so of poor quality. However, another important thing is that the bulk of the population have a trunk diameters of less than 30 centimetres in diameter. So it's clearly a very young population, and this implies that there's good opportunities for improvement through silvicultural intervention, its management. The sheer vigour and abundance of the natural regeneration process is another remarkable feature. This emerging resource has typically regenerated on previously cleared land. And despite continued grazing, Totara cover often continues to increase. And this illustrates some more interesting characteristics. Firstly, its prevalence often has a relationship to the modifying influences of and past and continuing farming activity. And secondly, it's a very sporadic distribution pattern spread over large areas, mostly in patches of scrub, but also as small groups and even as scattered individual trees on farms. Consequently, it's often very difficult to separate out the farm from the forest. Another feature is that many farms already have some harvestable sized trees that have regenerated over the last 150 years or so. So it's not a case of planting now and waiting for 80 years or more. In theory, some regional production could even start now. Much of the resource is relatively easy to access and extract from around the fringes of the farm or the bush. However, it is a case of small quantities from here, there and everywhere and over many different properties. And of course, as there always are, there are legal matters to contend with. The Forest Act applies. However, it can be very difficult to apply to the typical farm situation. It's also a time-consuming process, often with associated costs, and this presents significant disincentives for many landowners to get engaged with managing their regenerating totara. Nevertheless, we have demonstrated that in many situations, sustainable harvest permits can be obtained, and we're in dialogue with MAF regarding the legal issues. Some of us now have practical experience executing a trial harvest operation under the Forest Act and using continuous cover forestry practices. This means single stem extraction. There is no clear felling. In nearly every instance, harvested trees were either individually selected from either a dense group of stems or a pair of trees at close spacing. And good practice is to leave the best trees standing. That's to use harvest as a stand improvement tool. It's culling rather than creaming it. However, such responsible tree selection for long-term management, it involves targeting a high proportion of trees with poorer log grades, and of course this has implications for the grade of timber that's recovered. And this brings me to our most recent SFF project, which is a survey of the use of farm or regenerated totara timber and its market potential. We conducted over 50 in-depth survey interviews with members of key stakeholder groups. These included landowners, sawmillers and timber merchants, cabinet makers and wood processors, iwi, carvers, architects and designers, and wood quality scientists. And the project documented practical experiences and knowledge about the milling, drying, handling, working, finishing, and the uses of regenerated farm totara. It also surveyed perceptions around market potential. And we found that farm totara has been widely used from everything from stockyards to literally the kitchen sink, even a log house. Of course, totara was and still is revered by Maori. It's part of our cultural heritage. And it's still sought after for contemporary cultural use. It was also revered by the early settlers. And old-growth totara timber has a superb reputation as one of the most durable of our native timbers, easily worked and very stable. So the second-growth resource certainly has what you call a fine pedigree as a timber species. But how does this younger second-growth resource really compare now in timber quality? Sawmillers have all confirmed that it's very easily milled and easy to handle. And many consider that farm-grown totara in Northland is much stronger than the old-growth totara of the central North Island. And preliminary wood quality studies indicate that it may indeed be denser, equivalent to macrocarpa. However, the big difference between the old-growth timber and the younger farm-grown trees is the relative proportion of heartwood versus sapwood. Log number 7 on the right here shows the typical characteristics of younger stems. In this case, it was a top log. It's a large proportion of sapwood, that's the lighter colour around the outside, often an in-between area of incipient heart, and a very small core of heartwood. And although not considered durable for outdoor uses, lab tests show that the sapwood, the lighter coloured part, still has many of the inherent qualities and properties of the old-growth timber. And here are some examples. Fine art and craftsmanship, feature grade timber used in furniture, flooring, kitchens, cabinetry and wood turning, we've found that farm Totara has been widely used for interior linings, finishings, joinery, kitchens, cabinetry, furniture. However, and this is another important finding, this has not been at any significant commercial scale. People frequently compared its machining qualities and finishing qualities to macrocarpa, but most consider it had better colour and the intergrower knots tend to stay sound. The survey also captured market perceptions about its appearance and appeal, and it was very clear that regenerated Totara is considered to be an excellent softwood timber, suitable for many uses with a highly rated appearance. And one surprising result was that overall samples of sapwood, coloured and feature grade were generally attributed only slightly less market appeal than the clear heartwood grade. And this is perhaps a very fortuitous finding, considering that the bulk of the regenerating resource consists of feature, coloured and sapwood grade timber. The survey results also show very positive market indications. For example, 9 out of 10 architects say they would be interested in specifying that if there was a continuity of good quality supply. Many consider that Totara may even have a marketing edge, as the harvesting of farm Totara was perceived as being far more ecologically acceptable than the harvesting of other native timbers. And when we asked some of the participants if we should we be promoting the development of a sustainable industry around the commercial use of this native tree species, 24 out of 25 gave strong support, and 1 didn't know. So the results are all very, very encouraging. So, with so many positive indications, we have to ask, why is there not already a commercial industry based around this regenerating resource? We've identified 4 main points. Firstly, there's a lack of market awareness and demand. People don't think to use it. There's competition, very, very real competition with cheaper imported timbers. There are also some perceived and some real legal impediments and disincentives. These involve the Forests Act and the RMA, and for many landowners, dealing with these legal issues is a major disincentive for them to get involved with managing native trees on their farms. And fourthly, what I think is really the big one, is that there's no functioning commercial scale supply chain. This is something of a what comes first, chicken or egg type dilemma. As yet, there's no clear conceptual model of how to collectively manage this emerging resource. So you can see that there's still plenty of things to work on. And this brings me back to an important point. Why are we putting so much effort into the promotion of the commercial use of this native tree species? How can that possibly be a good thing? It's cutting down native trees. Well, for me, Morgan Williams, the former Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, he really distilled the matter. He said that commodity markets are the biggest drivers and shapers of our private rural land. It's markets that determine what we grow, how we grow it, our land use choices and our land use changes. And for me, pine trees and cows are particularly good evidence of this. And he saw the real challenge is to try and get the markets to shape it for the better, engineer an outcome that achieves that. And this paradigm suggests that if we want to see more native trees on the farm, then encouraging the commercial use of this native timber species may be not only a practical but an appropriate vehicle to achieve that outcome. And it's developing that vision into a viable land use option for farmers and landowners. That's the goal of the Northland Totara Working Group. The success of this group's farm forestry initiative has the potential to result in social, economic and environmental gains for many local communities in the Northland region and probably elsewhere around the country. What I must stress is that engineering this ideal outcome is required. It's not just happening by itself. And in that respect, without the support of the New Zealand Landcare Trust and Tane's Tree Trust and our project funders, we wouldn't have achieved what we have to date, and the outcome is still far from certain. However, we believe that this is a very worthy and promising effort, and therefore we hope for continued support so that ultimately our efforts will see that this native tree species play a bigger role, have a greater role in our rural production landscapes. Thank you very much for listening.